On a gray November morning in Turner County, Georgia, Opal Whitfield opened a temporary electric fence and let 32 pigs walk into her family's pecan orchard. The pigs did what pigs do. They put their noses down, they snorted, they pushed through the wet leaves under the trees and started eating the broken pecans, rotten husks, and half-buried nuts that had been sitting there since harvest. From the road, it looked like a mistake. It looked like a young woman had taken one of the cleanest pecan orchards in Turner County and turned it into a hog lot. By 8:30 that morning, two pickup trucks had slowed down on the county road. By 9:15, Opal's father, Wendell Whitfield, was standing by the shop with his arms crossed, watching 32 pigs work their way under trees his own father had planted. He did not say anything at first. That was worse than yelling. Wendell Whitfield was not a loud man. He was 63 years old, broad in the shoulders, thinner than he used to be. He had a face weathered by 4 decades of Georgia sun and Georgia rain and eyes that could hold a look longer than most men could hold a heavy sack. He had been farming pecans since he was old enough to hold a shovel. He had in that time learned exactly one thing about a pecan orchard that mattered more than anything else. The orchard usually punished people who talked too much and observed too little, so he did not talk that morning, he just watched. Finally, when Opal came out of the shop with a clipboard in her hand, he looked at her and he said only, "I hope you know what you're doing." Opal looked at the pigs. One of them had just found a soft pile of rotten husks and was eating like it had discovered buried treasure. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's why we're measuring it." That was the answer Wendell liked least, because it sounded like college. And to understand why that bothered him, you need to understand what a pecan orchard meant in that part of Georgia. The Whitfield family had been growing pecans outside Ashburn since 1978. That was the year Opal's grandfather, Silas Whitfield, bought 80 acres from a neighbor who was getting out of tree crops and going into peanuts. Back then, the trees were young, the equipment was old, and the whole place looked more like a gamble than a business. But over time, the orchard grew. Silas added more trees in the 80s. Wendell added more in the 90s. They improved the irrigation. They bought better harvest equipment. They learned the timing of their land the way some men learn the timing of an engine. By the time Opal came home from college, the Whitfield orchard covered just over 240 acres. It was not a giant operation, but it was solid. Wendell knew which blocks held water after a hard rain. He knew which rows always had heavier pressure from insects. He knew which trees dropped early and which ones hung on too long. He knew when the soil was too wet to run equipment, and he knew when he had no choice but to run it anyway. He was careful, he was steady, he was respected, and he did not need his youngest daughter bringing pigs into the orchard like she had discovered something the whole county had somehow missed. But you should understand who Opal was before we go further, because a story about a young woman changing her father's mind is only as interesting as the mind that has to be changed. Opal Whitfield was 27 years old that November morning, 5'4", dark blonde hair pulled back under a canvas cap that had belonged to her grandfather. She wore work boots that had been resold twice a barn jacket that still carried the smell of Athens and college coffee shops in the lining, and jeans stiff with the kind of red Georgia clay that never quite washed out. She had gone to the University of Georgia to study agricultural science. She had gone thinking she might work in crop consulting. She liked numbers. She liked soil tests. She liked the way good data could cut through a room full of opinions. But during her junior year, she took a class on integrated pest management, and that class changed the way she looked at orchards. The professor was a woman named Dr. Ruth Halsey. She had grown up on a dairy farm in Alabama. She had gone to school in North Carolina. She had spent 12 years in the field and 18 years in a lecture hall, and she had a habit of walking to the window in the middle of a slide and looking out at the parking lot when she was about to say the sentence she most wanted the students to remember. She said it that first week. She said, "Most pest problems do not begin where farmers notice them." Opal wrote it down. At first, Opal thought that sounded too clever. Then Dr. Halsey started showing them examples. Insects that damaged fruit on the tree but spent part of their life cycle in leaf litter, larvae that survived in fallen nuts, fungal problems that carried over in rotting plant material, pests that did not appear out of nowhere in spring but had been waiting all winter in the soil under debris inside old husks or in the messy places farmers stopped looking after harvest. That idea stayed with Opal because when she thought about her family's orchard, she saw the same thing. Every fall, after harvest, there was always a layer of waste under the trees. Broken pecans, shucks, leaves, nuts with damage, nuts the harvester missed, pieces that were too wet, too small, too rotten, or too far gone to matter. To most people, it was just residue. To Opal, it started to look like habitat, not good habitat, pest habitat, disease habitat. A place where next year's problem could sleep through winter. She started reading about livestock integration in orchards, not as a gimmick, not as a cute farm video, as a real management tool. Pigs were especially interesting to her because pigs did not just graze. They searched. They used their noses like tools. They turned over surface litter. They ate fallen fruit nuts, grubs, larvae, and anything else edible hidden in that top layer of orchard debris. That made them dangerous if unmanaged, but it also made them useful. The question was not, are pigs messy? Of course, pigs were messy. The question was, could pigs be managed tightly enough to clean the orchard floor without damaging the trees? Opal came home in May with that question in her notebook. She did not tell her father about it right away. She waited 3 weeks. She wanted to see the orchard again in summer light with her own eyes. She wanted to walk the blocks. She wanted to check the fence lines. She wanted to see up close whether the idea she had built at a desk in Athens still held together in the red clay of Ashburn. For those 3 weeks, she said almost nothing about her class. Her mother, Hetty Whitfield, noticed anyway. Hetty was 60 years old, silver hair pinned back, glasses on a chain around her neck, the kind of woman who had run the books on a working orchard for 32 years and had never once needed anyone to remind her which invoice was still unpaid. She was, as always, the smartest person in the room, which meant she said the least. Late in the 3rd week, on a Sunday evening after supper, Hetty found her daughter sitting on the front porch with a notebook on her knees, watching the last light disappear over the pecan trees. Hetty sat down beside her. She did not ask what Opal was working on. She said only, "You cleaning out the storeroom this fall?" Opal looked at her. Hetty said, "The one behind the big shed. Your grandpa's things are still in there. Nobody's touched them since he passed. I've been meaning to ask you to sort through them before Christmas." Opal said, "When?" Hetty said, "Whenever you're ready." Opal said, "I'll do it in September." Hetty nodded. She did not say anything else. But when she stood up, she squeezed Opal's shoulder once. That was Hetty Whitfield's way. The Whitfield storeroom sat behind the big equipment shed at the end of a gravel path lined with pecan hulls. It was a wooden building, painted white a long time ago, with a tin roof gone rust orange at the edges, and a door that stuck in humid weather. Silas Whitfield had built it himself in 1981. He had used it for tools, records, seed samples, spare parts, old catalogs, and any object he did not want to throw away and did not know what to do with. He had died in a chair by the window of the front room in the fall of 2011. He had been 79 years old. His last words, according to Wendell, were about a length of fence wire he had bought the week before and had not yet used. He had said it the way a man leaves a message on an answering machine. Then he was gone. The storeroom had not been opened except to shove things into it since the day of the funeral. Opal opened it on a Saturday morning in September. The rain that day was light. The wind smelled like fermenting pecans from the block behind the pump house. Inside the storeroom, the air was thick with the smell of cedar shavings and old paper and something faintly sweet, like the last of last year's harvest still hanging onto the corners. She started at the front. She sorted for 4 hours. She made a pile for keep, a pile for burn, and a pile for take a second look. Around noon, she pulled a wooden crate out from behind a stack of feed sacks along the back wall. It was pecan, dovetail joints, iron handles gone rust brown with time. It was not labeled. The lid was not nailed shut. It lifted on its hinges without a sound. Inside the crate were 3 things: a leather notebook, green the size of a paperback, the corner softened by years of hands. A carpenter's ruler, wood, 24 inches long, folding the brass hinges dulled by the oil of somebody's fingers. And a letter. The letter was folded 3 ways. The paper had gone yellow at the edges. The envelope had a return address on Baldwin Hall at the University of Georgia and was postmarked May 1984. Opal sat down on the storeroom floor. She did not open the notebook for 20 minutes. She just looked at it, because she knew without opening it whose handwriting was going to be inside. She opened the letter first. It was 2 pages long. It was addressed to Silas Whitfield, Route 2, Ashburn, Georgia. It was signed by a professor named Dr. Allen Halsey. Dr. Halsey. Opal read that name twice. She did not know a Dr. Allen Halsey, but she did know a Dr. Ruth Halsey. And Ruth Halsey had once mentioned in passing that her late father had been an extension entomologist at UGA in the 1980s. Opal set the letter down. She sat very still. Then she picked it up again. The letter was polite, formal. It thanked Silas for the correspondence of March 14th. It said the idea he had described, the use of swine to consume post-harvest residue in mature pecan blocks, had merit, but that there was no available research funding for such an approach at that time. It suggested he might reach out again in a decade or so when the university's interest in what the letter called alternative orchard management might have grown. The last paragraph said, and I remember this line exactly, "I hope you will consider keeping your notes. Ideas like yours have a way of finding the next generation even when they do not find the present one." Opal folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. She picked up the notebook. The first entry was dated March 4th, 1984. Silas would have been 52 years old. Wendell would have been 22. The handwriting was small and careful, the letters slightly slanted, the ink pressed hard into the paper, the way older men used to write back when a pen was a serious object. The first line said, "Dr. Halsey said the idea has merit but no funding. Perhaps another decade. Perhaps another generation." Opal read it twice. Then she kept reading. The entries went on for 39 pages. They described a plan, a careful, measured engineer's plan. A plan to run 20 feeder pigs through the oldest block of the orchard in short-duration paddocks after the fall harvest with tight fencing and daily observation. The entries were dry, technical, written by a man who was trying not to let his hope show on the page. They included a sketch on page 11 of the block Silas had chosen. It was the South Block, the same block Opal had been thinking about for 3 weeks. The same block that 41 years later had the worst pest carryover on the farm. Opal read every page. She read through the mid-April entries where Silas had priced fencing at $10 a spool. She read through the mid-May entries where he had contacted a hog farmer named Beecham in the next county. She read through the June entries where he had begun to draw paddock diagrams. Then the entries stopped on page 28, dated August 9th, 1984. The last line said, "I am setting this aside. The reason is not the pigs. The reason is at home." Then blank pages. 11 blank pages. Opal closed the notebook. She sat on the storeroom floor for a long time. She was still holding the letter in her other hand. She had not looked at the ruler yet, but she already knew what she was going to do. She was going to finish what her grandfather had started. She was going to find out why he stopped, and she was going to do it before the next harvest, downstairs. That is a strange word to use in a storeroom that has no upstairs. But that is what Opal thought as she climbed to her feet with the notebook in one hand and the letter in the other. Downstairs. Meaning back in the house, back in the kitchen, back at the table where her father was sitting with his coffee and where he did not know yet that his life was about to change. He did not know she had found the crate. He would not know for another 5 months. By then, it would already be too late to stop her. But you should understand who he was before we go further. Because a story about a young woman changing her father's mind is only as interesting as the mind that has to be changed. Wendell Whitfield had been born in 1962 in the same white farmhouse where he still slept. He had gone to school in Ashburn. He had married Hetty Bennett from a family 2 counties over in 1985. He had taken over the orchard from his father in 2004, 7 years before Silas died, back when the older man's hands had started to shake too badly to hold pruning shears. He had worked the orchard for 40 years. He was not stupid. He was not stubborn for the sake of being stubborn. He had opinions about spray programs that were based on 28 years of watching sprays work and fail. He had opinions about harvest equipment that he could defend for an hour at a time. He was in the estimation of the man who ran the Turner County Extension Office, one of the 4 best pecan growers in the county. He had, in his own opinion, exactly one weakness as a farmer. He believed in tools. He believed in the sprayer. He believed in the tractor. He believed in the label on the bag. He believed that if a pest showed up, there was a product for the pest, And if you use the product according to the instructions, the pest would go away. And if the pest did not go away, you had used the wrong product. This was not a philosophy. This was to him simply the way farming worked. His daughter, on the other hand, had gone to college. His daughter had come home with a green notebook. His daughter was about to sit down at his kitchen table and suggest that 32 pigs were a better answer than any bag on any shelf. He was going to say no. He was going to say it loud. But that was still 5 months away. The morning Opal brought the notebook and the letter down to the kitchen. It was a Wednesday in early February. The sky was low and gray, the kind of gray that promised rain without delivering it. The kitchen smelled of coffee and bacon fat, and the wet wool smell of a jacket that had been drying on the back of a chair since dawn. Wendell was at the head of the table. Hetty was at the sink. Opal set the notebook down on the table in front of her father. She did not open it, neither did he. He looked at it the way a man looks at a snake that has come into the yard through the wrong hole in the fence. "What is this?" he said, not a question. Opal poured herself a cup of coffee. "It's Grandpa's," she said. Wendell went very still. He did not touch the notebook. He said, "Where did you find it?" She said, "In the crate, in the storeroom, behind the big shed." He said, "The crate." She said, "The cedar one, under the feed sacks." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, without lifting his eyes, "I have not opened that crate since 2011. She said, "I know." He said, "Why did you?" She said, "Because Mom asked me to sort the storeroom." That was not the whole answer. He knew it. She knew he knew it, but he did not press. He was on that Wednesday morning still trying to hold the notebook at arm's length the way a man holds a snake he cannot quite decide whether to kill or release. Opal said, "There's a letter too." She set it beside the notebook. Wendell looked at the letter. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the postmark. Then, very slowly, he pulled it toward him. He read it in silence. He read it 3 times. When he was done, he set it down flat on the table, and he put both his hands on it, and he closed his eyes for about 6 seconds. Then he opened his eyes. He said, "Halsey." Opal said, "Alan Halsey, from UGA. He passed in 2006. His daughter is Ruth Halsey. She's the professor who taught my integrated pest management class last year." Wendell looked at her. He did not say anything. But something moved behind his face, something that had been sitting still for a long time. Hetty at the sink had stopped washing the coffee cup. She was standing with her hands in the water and her back to the table, and she was not moving at all. Opal said, "Dad." Wendell said, "Yes." She said, "I want to try it," what he was going to try. "This fall, after the harvest, 32 pigs in the South Block, 5 acres, 1 trial paddock. I have the numbers, I have the layout, I have a hog farmer in the next county who will rent them to me. I have talked to Ruth Halsey about protocol. I have a control block already picked out." Wendell picked up his coffee mug. He drank. He set it down. He said no. That was all. 1 word. He stood up. He walked past his daughter without looking at her. He walked out into the yard, and that would have been the end of it. Except that Opal did not know and had no way of knowing why he had said no. She thought he was being stubborn. She thought he was being old. She thought he was being the same kind of American father 1,000 daughters had come home to and shouted at and slammed doors and all the way back to the beginning of the country. She was wrong. He was not being stubborn. He was being scared. And the reason he was scared was something he had never told her and would not tell her for another 6 weeks. Here's what he had not told her. In the summer of 1984, when Wendell was 22 years old, home from Georgia Southern for what would turn out to be the last time as a college student, his father, Silas, had drawn a diagram on a paper grocery bag at the kitchen table. The diagram showed 20 feeder pigs in a 5-acre paddock in the South Block after the fall harvest. Wendell had been at that table. He had asked good questions. He had thought it was a good idea. But then in early July, his mother had been diagnosed with a slow cancer. She had lived another 27 years. She had lived long enough to see Wendell married, to see Opal born, to see the orchard expand to 240 acres. But that summer in 1984, she had needed constant care, and Silas had made a choice. He had folded the paper grocery bag, he had put it in the crate, he had put the crate in the storeroom, he had never spoken of the pigs again, not to Wendell, not to anyone. And Wendell, watching his father from 22 years old to the day the old man died in 2011, had drawn a lesson from all of it. The lesson was not that the pigs would not work. The lesson was this: there will always be a summer when your mother gets sick. There will always be a reason to fold the paper, and the man who folds the paper does not later get to unfold it. He had held that lesson for 41 years. He was not going to let his daughter break it. Not for pigs, not for a notebook, not for any letter from any professor in any drawer of any university in the state of Georgia. Wendell came back to the kitchen 30 minutes later. Opal was still at the table. She had not moved. The notebook was in front of her. The letter was still under Wendell's hands, where he had left it. He sat down. He picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. Then he said, without looking at her, "You know your grandpa tried this." It was not a question. Opal said very quietly, "I know he wrote about it." Wendell nodded once. "You read the notebook?" "Yes." He nodded again. "Then you know he quit." "I know he wrote that he was quitting." "That's the same thing." "It isn't." Wendell looked up. For the first time in the conversation, he was looking at her the way a father looks at a daughter who has said something he did not expect her to be able to say. "Explain the difference," he said. Opal took a breath. "He wrote that the reason was not the pigs. He wrote that the reason was at home. That is a specific sentence, Dad. He did not say the method failed. He did not say the community won. He said something at home made him stop. And I want to know what it was." Wendell looked out the window. The rain that had been threatening all morning had finally started. "It was your grandmother," he said. "The cancer. The summer of '84. He couldn't split his attention. He had to choose. He chose her." Opal said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Then the pigs weren't a failure." "No," Wendell said. "They weren't." He set the coffee down. "But the laughter was real," he said. "Cal Kessler laughed at your grandpa in 1985 at the co-op meeting for something else entirely, and it stuck to him for the rest of his life. That is what small towns do. They remember the laugh. They do not remember the reason. And I am telling you now, before you go any further, that this county will not laugh at me, or at your mother, or at you. Not again. Not for this." Opal said, "They already laughed, Dad." He looked at her sharply. "Gus Kessler, the men at the coffee counter, the boys at the co-op meeting last October, they laugh about the orchard. They laugh about the debt. I heard them. Mom heard them. You've been pretending you don't hear them, but you do." Wendell did not answer, because she was right. Hetty at the sink turned around slowly. She looked at her husband. She looked at her daughter, and then she said in a voice as flat as an iron sheet, "Let her try, Wendell." He turned toward his wife. "Hetty, let her try. 5 acres, after harvest. If it works, we might not have to sell the east block. If it doesn't, we lose the fence and the pig rent, and we've lost worse." Opal's head came up. "What east block?" Nobody answered her. That was how Opal Whitfield learned on a Wednesday morning in early February that the orchard was $210,000 in debt to First Peach Bank in Ashburn, and that if the coming season went badly, her family was going to have to sell 40 acres of the East Block to a man named Gus Kessler. She sat very still. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried at a kitchen table. She looked at her father. She said, "You should have told me." He said, "I should have told you a lot of things." That was all he said. The notebook stayed on the table between them. Neither of them touched it for a long time. Finally, he pushed it back across the wood. 5 acres, he said. 1 paddock after harvest. You do everything the way that notebook says and everything Ruth Halsey tells you, and you do not deviate, and you do not embarrass this family. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "And Opal?" "Yes." He looked at her. "If those pigs tear up my irrigation, we are done. And if this county laughs at you, you do not laugh back. You do not fight them. You let the harvest do the talking. Do you know why?" She waited. "Because your grandpa did the same thing, and if you do it his way, you might get to finish what he started." She nodded. He stood up. He walked out. Hetty came over and sat down in his chair. She did not say anything for a while. Then she reached across the table and laid her hand flat on the notebook. "He will come around," she said. Opal looked at her. "How do you know?" Hetty smiled a small, tired smile. "Because he wanted to say yes 41 years ago." The rest of the winter passed the way winters pass in South Georgia, slow, wet, full of small chores that were more about waiting than about doing. Opal spent February reading. She read Silas's notebook 3 times. She read the letter twice. She read every livestock integration paper Ruth Halsey had sent her, and then she read 3 more that she found herself in the university library's online archive. By early March, she had a plan. She had priced the fencing. She had contacted a hog farmer 20 miles away in the next county a man named Charlie Beecham who was willing to rent 32 feeder pigs to her for a short post-harvest run. She had marked the South Block on a map she had drawn herself with a copy of Silas's 1984 sketch pinned to the corner of the page. The two sketches, hers and his, were almost identical. She did not show that to her father, not yet. By late September, she had the fencing, bought the paddock layout drawn, and the pigs lined up. That was when the rest of the county started talking, and the loudest voice belonged to a man named Gus Kessler. Gus Kessler owned Kessler Ag Supply on the edge of Ashburn. He sold spray products, fertilizer, parts, equipment, and enough advice to keep his coffee counter full every morning from 7 to 9. Gus was 58 years old. He wore a starched shirt with the Kessler Ag logo stitched over the left pocket. He drove a white F350 with a chrome brush guard. He had the kind of wide neck and confident smile a man develops after 20 years of not being contradicted by anyone he cared to listen to. Gus was not by most measures a bad man. Most farmers liked him. He knew their operations. He knew their fathers. He knew who had a good year, who was stretched thin, who needed a payment plan, and who would never ask for help even when he needed it. He had been around long enough to be useful, and he had been right often enough to be listened to. But Gus had built his business on a certain understanding of farming. Problems had products. Pests had programs. Orchards had schedules. And if you followed the right program at the right time, you stayed ahead of trouble. So when Gus heard at his coffee counter on a Friday morning in early October that Opal Whitfield was planning to put pigs in a pecan orchard, he laughed. Not cruelly at first, just the way a man laughs when he hears something too strange to take seriously. Opal was in Kessler Ag Supply that morning. She was buying extra fence posts. She heard him at the coffee counter. "I've heard of cover crops," Gus was saying. "I've heard of grazing cattle between rows. I've heard all kinds of things. But hogs under pecan trees, that's a new one." One of the men at the counter asked, "What's she trying to do?" "Let the pigs eat the bad nuts," Gus said. "Root around for bugs, clean up the orchard floor." Somebody chuckled. Gus lifted his coffee. "I'll tell you what cleans up an orchard floor," he said. "Equipment, labor, a good spray program, not a bunch of hogs looking for trouble." Opal came around the aisle with the fence posts in her cart. The room got quiet. Gus turned and saw her. To his credit, he did not pretend she had not heard. "Opal," he said, "Mr. Kessler, we were just talking about your experiment." "I heard." Gus nodded toward the posts. "You really going through with it?" 5 acres. Hogs are hard on ground. They can be. They root. They do. They get bored. They get destructive. They get and they don't read research papers. Opal smiled a little. "No," she said. "That's why the fence matters." The men at the counter laughed at that, but Gus did not. He studied her for a second. "You really think pigs are going to lower your pest pressure next spring?" "I think they might reduce the amount of infected and infested material that carries over after harvest," Opal said. "I don't think they replace the whole pest management plan. I think they might remove part of the problem before it becomes next year's problem." Gus took a sip of coffee. "That sounds nice," he said. "But nice ideas get expensive when they hit real dirt." Opal nodded. "That's why we're measuring it." There it was again. That answer. Measuring it, not believing it, not defending it, not selling it, measuring it. Gus smiled. But it was the kind of smile older men sometimes give young people when they think time is about to teach the lesson for them. "Well," he said, "I hope you're right." At the end of the counter on a red vinyl stool, nobody ever seemed to claim there was another man. He was 72 years old. He wore a canvas jacket that had been washed so many times the collar had gone the color of a paper bag. His hands were spotted from a lifetime of sun and surprisingly steady when he set his coffee cup down on the counter. His name was Otis Fales. He had known Silas Whitfield since they were both 12 years old. He had not spoken at the coffee counter that morning. He had not laughed. He was watching Opal the way a man watches a thing he has been waiting for. Opal did not know his name yet. She only knew his face. She saw him nod at her once as she paid for the fence posts. It was the smallest nod. It was not a signal. It was not a promise. It was just a nod. She nodded back. Then she went out into the rain. The pigs arrived on a Monday morning in early November. They were medium-sized feeder pigs, 32 of them, old enough to handle the weather, not so heavy that Opal worried about deep compaction. Charlie Beecham brought them up from his farm in the next county on a stock trailer with a red tailgate that had been repaired 3 times. Opal unloaded them into the first paddock and gave them water mineral and a little supplemental feed to keep them from getting too hungry and too aggressive with the ground. Then she opened the gate. For the first hour, the pigs moved slowly. They smelled the leaves. They found broken pecans. They crunched through soft husks. They pushed their noses into the top inch of soil and flipped over wet mats of debris. By noon, the difference was obvious. Not perfect, not clean like a machine had done it, but different. The layer of rotten material was broken apart. The leftover nuts were disappearing. The pigs were finding things Opal could not see. Wendell walked through the alley outside the fence, staring at the ground. Opal expected criticism. Instead, he said, "They're faster than I thought." That was all, but it was something. That night, after the pigs had gone into the shelter, and the water tubs had been refilled, and the fence had been checked twice, Opal sat at the kitchen table with the green notebook open beside her. She was writing in her own notebook, a spiral-bound one in her own hand. Day 1. 32 pigs released 7:40 a.m. Recovered to shelter 5:15 p.m. Paddock covered 1 acre. Estimated ground disturbance in top 2 inches 62%. Rotten pecans in sample squares before release 147. After release 28. Then at the bottom of the page she wrote in smaller letters. He said they were faster than he thought. She underlined it once. Then she reached across the table and opened Silas's notebook to the last written page. August 9th, 1984. The reason is at home. She turned the page. She turned another. She turned 3 more. She had not in all her reading turned that far. She had assumed the rest was blank. Most of it was, but on the 6th blank page after the last written entry, in the same careful handwriting and the same faded blue ink, there was a single line she had never seen. She had never turned that far, it said. "The land keeps ledgers longer than we do." Then underneath in smaller letters, SW, August 1984. Opal read it 4 times. She closed the notebook. She did not cry. She would not cry for another 5 months. But she sat at the kitchen table with her hand on the leather cover for a long time. Outside, the rain had started again. The pigs were in the shelter. The orchard was quiet. Wendell was in the front room watching the 10 o'clock news with the sound turned low. Hetty was in the pantry closing a jar of pickled peaches she had opened for supper and forgotten to put away. And somewhere in a small yellow house on the west side of Ashburn, an old man named Otis Fales was sitting at his own kitchen table reading a Turner County newspaper article about a young woman who had put 32 pigs into a pecan orchard and folding the article carefully in half and putting it inside a plain brown envelope and writing on the outside of the envelope in a hand that had not written anything important in 15 years the name Silas. He put the envelope in the drawer with his father's watch. He turned out the kitchen light. He went to bed. Outside in the pecan orchards of Turner County, Georgia, 32 feeder pigs slept in a portable shelter under a sky full of low clouds, and above them on 80 of the 240 acres, the ghost of a plan that had been folded and put in a crate in 1984 had begun at last to unfold itself. The season had not started yet. But the season was beginning to notice. For the next 8 days, Opal ran the pigs through small sections of the 5-acre block, never too long, never when the soil got too wet, never close to young trees. She checked the fence twice a day. She checked the irrigation lines every evening. She measured soil disturbance by depth. She counted exposed roots. She counted leftover nuts. She took photos from the same mark points standing in the same place at the same time of morning, so the light in the pictures would be honest. She weighed feed. She tracked pig weight. She wrote everything down. The pigs were not perfect workers. They knocked over a water tub twice. One of them found a weak spot in the fence on the 3rd morning and almost got into the next block before Opal caught it by the ear and walked it back through the gate, like a man walking a stubborn dog home from the vet. In one low corner of the paddock, they rooted deeper than she wanted. Wendell gave her a look that said he had been waiting for exactly that. But the orchard floor changed. By the end of the 5th day, most of the fallen pecans and rotten husks in the treated section were gone or broken down. The leaf litter was disturbed but not destroyed. The soil surface looked rough in places but not ruined. Opal took her samples. She wrote her numbers. She sent them to the extension lab in Tifton on a Tuesday morning, driving down herself so she would know exactly when the envelope reached the front desk. The pigs went home to Charlie Beecham's farm on the 9th day. Charlie was a quiet man of 40. He asked her how they had done. She told him the truth. She said, They did what pigs do. Charlie smiled at that. He said, I'll have them ready again next fall if you want. She said, I want. Then she drove home in her father's old truck with the empty stock trailer rattling behind her and the November wind coming in through the seams in the driver's door. That night, at the kitchen table, she wrote the last line in her spiral notebook. 8 days, 32 pigs, 1 paddock, 5 acres, ground surface changed, trees undamaged. Wendell said they're faster than I thought. He said it twice. She underlined the second line. Then she closed the notebook. She did not open it again for 11 weeks, because winter had arrived, and winter in the pecan country of South Georgia is the season of waiting. That is the hard part about ideas like Opal's. The work happens in November. The proof does not show up until spring. All winter people kept making jokes. At the gas station in Ashburn, at the coffee counter in Kessler Ag Supply, at the co-op meeting in early December, at church. Wendell, you selling pecans or pork now? Opal, those pigs on payroll yet? Somebody told me Gus said next year you'll be putting goats in the packing shed. Opal smiled when she had to. Wendell did not smile, but he did not tell her to stop talking about the trial either. That mattered, because in January, Opal showed him the first summary. The pig block had reduced visible leftover nuts and husks by more than half compared with the untreated block. Soil disturbance stayed mostly in the top 2 inches. There were a few problem spots, especially where the ground had stayed wet, but no serious root exposure in the measured areas. Wendell read the summary twice. Then he said, "Spring will tell." He was right. Spring always tells. But before spring came, something else came first. 2 things. The first was a visit. The second was a storm. The visit happened on a Tuesday morning in the middle of January. The rain had stopped for 2 days. The sky was that pale, tired gray that South Georgia gets after a long, wet stretch. The trees were bare. The orchard was quiet. Opal was in the yard tightening the wire on a permanent fence line that had loosened over the winter when a white F350 pulled slowly into the drive. She recognized it before it stopped. Gus Kessler. He got out. He was wearing a canvas coat over his starched Kessler Ag shirt. His boots were clean. His face was arranged into the shape a man's face takes when he has practiced what he is about to say. Wendell came out of the shop. He wiped his hands on a rag. He shook Gus's hand. He did not invite him inside. They stood in the yard. Gus said, "Long winter." Wendell said, "Same as always." Gus said, "I've been thinking about you." Wendell waited. Gus said, "About the note." Wendell did not answer. Gus said, "I want to help." Wendell said, "How?" Gus said, "I'd like to buy the East Block, at market, cash, no banker involved. That gets you out from under First Peach by June, and it gives your daughter the summer to figure out whether her project is going to work without a mortgage hanging over her." He said it kindly. He said it the way a good neighbor would say it if a good neighbor happened to have been circling 40 acres of land for 8 years, waiting for the right winter. Wendell looked at him. He looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "I will think about it." Gus said, "Take your time, but not too much time. My wife wants to know by the end of April." Wendell said, "I will think about it." Gus tipped his cap. He walked back to the truck. He drove away. Opal was still standing at the fence. She had not moved. Her father walked over to her. He did not speak at first. He just stood beside her looking at the gate where Gus's truck had turned onto the county road. Then he said so quietly, Opal almost did not hear him. "He knows about the note." Opal said, "How?" Wendell said, "First Peach has 1 loan officer under 50. His name is Bobby Kessler, Gus's nephew." Opal did not answer. Wendell said, "I have known that for 2 years. I did not tell you because there was nothing to be done about it. I am telling you now because you should know why the smile bothered you." She said, "It did bother me." He said, "It should have." He walked back to the shop. Hetty had been watching from the kitchen window. When Opal came inside, Hetty was already sitting at the table with 2 cups of coffee poured. She said, "Sit down." Opal sat. Hetty said, "Your father is a proud man. He will not tell you how bad it is, so I will." Opal said, "Mom." Hetty said, "The note is called due on June 15th, $210,000. If we cannot refinance, First Peach has the right to force a sale. The East Block at market is worth about 260,000. That is what Gus offered your father this morning. That is exactly what the bank would take. Opal said, he offered market. Hetty said, he offered market because he knows a foreclosure would drag the price down. Opal said, he's helping himself. Hetty said, he always has been. Opal put her hand on the edge of the table. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried at a kitchen table. But she gripped the wood hard enough that Hetty saw her knuckles go white, and Hetty said nothing about it. Hetty was not that kind of mother. She just let her daughter have the coffee and the quiet and the moment. Then Hetty said, you have 4 months. Opal said 4 months. Hetty said, that is enough if the numbers hold. Opal said, the numbers will hold. Hetty said, good. She stood up. She took her cup to the sink. She said without turning around, do not tell your father I told you. Opal said, I won't. Hetty said, he would want to have told you himself. He just cannot find the way to say it out loud. That is his weakness. I have carried it for 32 years. I do not mind carrying it for 4 more months. But you should know what he is trying to hold up. Opal said, I know. Hetty said, then hold your end. That was the end of that conversation. Opal went out to the orchard. She walked the whole 240 acres. She walked every row of the south block and every row of the middle blocks and every row of the east block that Gus Kessler was already in his own mind counting as his own. She did not walk it fast. She walked it the way her grandfather had walked it 30 and 40 years ago before she was born. Slow, careful, counting. She did not tell her father where she had gone. But when she came in at dark, he looked at her once from the head of the table, and he saw the mud on her boots, and he did not comment on it. He knew. The storm came on a Friday night 6 days later. It was not the storm anyone had been expecting. The weather radio had said rain moderate to heavy coming in off the Gulf. That was all. A normal January soaking, the kind of rain that South Georgia had 100 nights every winter. But the front stalled over Turner County around 10 o'clock. The rain went from steady to hard. The wind picked up from the southwest. By midnight, the gauge at the pump house was showing 3 inches. By 1 in the morning, it was showing 5. Opal woke up at 2:40. She woke up because she heard a sound she did not recognize. Not the rain, not the wind, not the tin roof of the shop rattling. Something under those sounds. Something metallic, something wrong. She sat up in bed. She listened for another minute. Then she got dressed. She put on her jacket and her rubber boots and her wool cap, and she picked up her flashlight from the top of the dresser, and she went down the back stairs of the farmhouse 2 at a time. Her father was already awake. He was standing in the kitchen in his coveralls with his own flashlight in one hand and the shop key in the other. He did not ask her if she had heard something. He said only, South Block, now. They went out into the rain together. The wind was coming across the orchard at an angle. The trees were bent. The trellis wires that ran between the fence posts of the temporary paddock, which Opal had rolled up and stored against the shed wall in November, were flat on the ground, now blown over by the storm. The old fence line along the west side of the south block was down in 2 places. That was not what was wrong. What was wrong was in the middle of the block. The main irrigation line for the south block ran underground for most of its length, but it surfaced in 3 places at riser valves where a farmer could open a spigot and take a sample or attach a hose. The middle riser was 50 yards into the block. Opal reached it first. She stopped. She lifted the flashlight. The riser was split open. Not broken, split. Along a seam that ran 1.5 feet up the pipe in a clean straight line, as if something long and heavy had come down on it and pried it apart. Water was pumping out of the split into a low hollow in the ground. The hollow, which had been dry a week ago, was now a small, dark pond. Wendell came up behind her. He stopped. He raised his own flashlight. He looked at the split for a long time. Then he shone the flashlight on the ground around the riser. In the mud and the beam of the light were boot prints. They were not Opal's. They were not Wendell's. They were size 11s or possibly 12s. The tread was a lug pattern, deep and irregular, the kind of tread you find on the sole of a work boot that has been resoled at least once. The prints came in from the direction of the county road along the west fence line where the trellis wires were down. They went back the same way. There were no other prints in the block. The prints had not been made by a pig. The prints had not been made by any 4-legged animal. The pigs had been gone for 11 weeks. Wendell stood in the rain and looked at the prints. He did not speak. He did not curse. He did not swing the flashlight. He just stood there in his coveralls with rain running off the brim of his cap, and Opal watched him try to hold together something inside himself that she had never seen him have to hold before. Finally, he said, "Get the shut-off." She said, "Where?" He said, "Pump house, main valve, left side, full clockwise." She ran. By the time she came back 10 minutes later, he had already begun to build a temporary clamp on the split using a length of rubber and 2 hose clamps from the emergency box he kept in the truck. He worked in silence. She held the flashlight. The rain kept falling. Halfway through the repair, he said without looking at her, "This was not a pig." She said, "I know." He said, "And it was not an accident." She said, "I know." He said, "And whoever did it knew that the storm would cover the prints by morning." She said, "I know." He said, "But he did not know that you would hear it at 2:40 in the morning through a closed window in a rainstorm." She said, "I did not know I would either." He worked for another minute. Then he said, "Your grandmother had ears like yours. She could hear a tractor start from a mile away. She used to wake up before your grandfather in the summer if a bird got into the barn." Opal said nothing. He said, "That is not a gift you get from strangers. That is a thing you inherit." Then he finished the clamp. He stood up. He looked at her in the rain. He said, "Go to bed." She said, "Dad." He said, "I will sit in the shop the rest of the night. Nobody is coming back tonight, but somebody came tonight, and I need to think about that." She said, "I can sit with you." He said, "No." He said, "Go to bed, Opal. Tomorrow morning I need you sharp, because tomorrow morning we are going to start figuring out who this was, and I need one of us to have slept." She went inside. She did not sleep. But she sat on the edge of her bed in her wet clothes with the leather notebook in her lap, and she read the entry for July 12th, 1984, which she had read 6 times already, and she read the sentence at the end of the last written page, which she had read 100 times. "The reason is not the pigs. The reason is at home." She whispered to herself in the dark room so quietly that only she could hear, "Well, not this year." Then she closed the notebook. She lay down. She did not sleep, but she rested, and downstairs in the equipment shop, Wendell Whitfield sat on a folding chair with a shotgun across his knees, and he did not point it at anything, and he did not intend to fire it, but he kept it there anyway, because there are moments in a man's life when he needs to feel the weight of a thing across his legs, whether he plans to use it or not. He sat there until sunrise. Nobody came, but he sat there anyway, because his father had once folded a paper grocery bag in that same shop in 1984 after a summer of measuring 20 pigs he never got to buy, and Wendell Whitfield had decided sometime between the 2nd inch of rain and the 5th that no one was going to fold his daughter's paper. Not this year. The storm cleared by dawn. Wendell drove into Ashburn at 7:30 in the morning to buy a new riser valve. He went to Kessler Ag Supply. He did that on purpose. Gus Kessler was at the coffee counter with 3 other men. Wendell walked past them without speaking. He bought the riser. He paid in cash. He walked back to the door. At the door, he stopped. He turned around. He looked at Gus Kessler for 6 seconds. He did not say anything. He walked out. Gus did not laugh that morning. Nobody at the coffee counter laughed. They did not know exactly why. But Wendell Whitfield had walked into that store the way a man walks into a store when he has decided something, and the men at the counter had felt it before he reached the door. Opal did not know he had gone, not until he came home. He put the riser on the shop bench. He said only, "New riser. I will install it tomorrow." She said, "Dad," he said, "I went to Kessler." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because if a man cuts your fence, you do not hide from him. You let him see you buying the pipe. That is how country works." She said, "Do you think he did it?" He said, "I do not know yet." He said, "But he is going to see us fix it." Then he walked out to the pump house to install the pressure gauge that he had bought a week ago and had not yet had the time to mount. Opal watched him go. She stood in the shop for a long moment. Then she picked up her spiral notebook and she wrote at the top of a fresh page, "Someone cut the riser in the night. Prince came from the county road. Dad went to Kessler this morning on purpose. He is not going to hide." She underlined the last line. Then she put the notebook back on the shelf. She had work to do. 2 mornings later, on a Thursday, an old red pickup truck pulled slowly into the Whitfield driveway. It came in at about 10 miles an hour. That was the first thing Opal noticed. Nobody in South Georgia drives 10 miles an hour into a farm driveway unless they are new, unsure, or ashamed. The man who got out was 72 years old. He was wearing the same canvas jacket she had seen at Kessler Ag Supply in October. His hands were spotted from a lifetime of sun. He stood beside his truck for a full minute before he closed the door. Then he walked slowly toward the shop where Wendell was mounting the pressure gauge. Wendell saw him coming. He set down the wrench. He did not say hello. He said, "Otis." The man said, "Wendell." They stood there for a moment. Then Otis Fales said, "I owe your daddy something I never paid back." Wendell did not answer. Otis said, "Can we talk?" Wendell said, "Come inside." They walked to the house. Hetty was in the kitchen. She saw Otis at the back door, and her face changed only for a second, the way a face changes when it recognizes a debt you had almost forgotten was owed to you. She poured him a cup of coffee. He took it with both hands. He sat down at the table. Opal came in from the yard. Otis looked up at her. He said, "Miss Whitfield." She said, "Mr. Fales." He said, "Opal." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to hear this too. It is not just for your daddy." She sat. He set the coffee down. He did not drink it. He said, "In 1984, when your grandpa Silas started talking about pigs in the South Block, I was one of the first men he told. He walked over to my place on a Sunday afternoon. He had a paper grocery bag with a drawing on it. He asked me if I would help him build the fence. He said I told him no. He said I laughed. He said I laughed the same laugh Gus Kessler laughed at the coffee counter in October. I did not think I was being cruel. I thought I was being funny. Your grandpa smiled the way he always smiled when a man he liked said something stupid. He thanked me for the coffee. He walked home. Otis put his hand flat on the table. He said, he never asked me again. He said, 2 months later, your grandmother's cancer came. Silas folded that paper bag and put it in a crate in the storeroom, and he never spoke of it again. Not to me, not to your daddy, not to anybody. He said he carried that laugh with him for 27 years. He carried it until he died in that chair by the window in the fall of 2011. He looked at Wendell. He said, I carried it too. Wendell did not speak. Otis said, I have been carrying it for 41 years. Wendell said quietly, Otis. Otis said, I am not asking you to forgive me. I am telling you so that we can move on to the reason I came. Wendell said, all right. Otis reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. He took out a folded piece of paper. It was yellow with age. He set it on the table. He said, this is a receipt from 1985, Kessler Ag Supply, signed by Cal Kessler, that is Gus's father. It was for a load of pesticide your grandpa bought under duress. Cal charged him double the going rate that spring because Silas had come to him after the co-op had run out. Cal knew. Silas knew. Cal signed the receipt with a smile. He said, I was in the store that morning. I saw it. I said nothing. He said, I am giving this to you today because Gus Kessler is his father's son, and whatever he is doing to you, he learned to do a long time ago. From a man who was not sorry either. Wendell picked up the paper. He unfolded it. He read it again. Then he refolded it carefully along the same creases, and he set it on the table between himself and his daughter. He said, thank you, Otis. Otis said, that is not a thank you receipt, Wendell. That is a warning. Wendell said, I know. Otis said, you watch that man. Wendell said, I have been. Otis stood up. He said, one more thing. He looked at Opal. He said, your grandpa did not fail in 1984. He stopped. There is a difference. And if you have not stopped, you have not failed. Do you know who told me that? She said no. He said, he did. He told me that in 1988, 4 years after he folded the paper bag, he said it about something else. But I have thought about it every year since, and I have been waiting a long time to say it to somebody who might need to hear it. He said, you needed to hear it. She said, yes. He said, all right then. He put on his cap. He walked to the door. At the door, he turned around one more time. He said, Mr. Whitfield, Miss Whitfield. Wendell said, yes. Otis said, I am 72 years old. I do not go to the coffee counter at Kessler Ag Supply anymore. I make my own coffee. I do it at 5:30 every morning. If either of you needs a witness, you come to my kitchen. I will be there. Then he walked out to his truck. He drove away. Hetty picked up his coffee cup from the table. It was full. He had not touched it. She poured it into the sink. She said, he came at the right time. Wendell said he came 41 years late. Hetty said, he came at the right time for now. Wendell did not answer. But he picked up the yellow receipt and he looked at it for a long moment, and then he took it into the front room and he put it inside the leather notebook that was sitting on the coffee table between page 28 and page 29 at the exact spot where Silas Whitfield had written in August of 1984, the reason is not the pigs, the reason is at home. And under that, in the space Silas had left blank, he wrote in his own hand in pencil, the reason has changed. Then he closed the notebook. Spring came early that year. By the middle of March, the pecan buds were breaking. By the last week of March, the leaves were out. By the first week of April, the insect pressure across Turner County was worse than it had been in 8 years. A warm winter had pushed the life cycles ahead. A wet January had left the orchard floors soft and rich for anything that wanted to overwinter in the residue. Every farmer in the county was scouting hard. Gus Kessler's phone was ringing off the hook. Growers were asking about spray timing. They were asking about what could be tank mixed. They were asking whether the pressure looked worse than last year. They were asking whether it was still worth spraying a block that had already taken damage. At the Whitfield place, Opal was checking traps and scouting leaves in 2 blocks. She was comparing the treated south block to the untreated middle block. The first week, the difference was small. The second week, it was still small. By the third week, it was harder to ignore. The untreated block had more signs of carryover pressure, more damaged leftover material, more insect activity in the places where rotten nuts had sat through winter. The pig block was not clean. It was not magic. It was not pest-free. It still needed management. But it was lighter. The problem was they're just not as strong. Wendell saw it before Opal said it. He was walking the south block with her on a Thursday evening when he stopped beside one of the sample rows and looked back toward the control area. He said, "This section looks better." Opal tried not to react too quickly. She said, "It does." He said, "You got numbers." She said, "I do." He said, "Show me after supper." That night, she put the charts on the kitchen table. Trap counts, visual scouting notes, cleanup cost comparison, soil disturbance ratings, pig rental cost, labor hours, estimated savings, not dramatic enough to make a headline, but strong enough to matter. Wendell leaned over the papers with his reading glasses low on his nose. Hetty sat beside him quiet. Finally, Wendell said, "What would it take to do 10 acres next fall?" Opal looked at him. 10. "Don't make me say it twice," she smiled. "I'd need more fencing, better water setup, and we'd avoid the low, wet corner." Wendell nodded. "Price it." That was the moment Opal knew the trial had become something else. Not a victory, not yet, but a real question. And real questions are where change begins. 2 weeks after that conversation, on the 4th of April, Opal drove into Ashburn on a Friday afternoon. She was going to the co-op meeting. She was going because she had asked to be added to the agenda. She was going to present the numbers. She had not told her father. She had not told her mother. She had told Ruth Halsey on the phone 3 nights before. Ruth had said only in her dry professor's voice, "Bring your control data and bring your mistake slide. Never present a trial without a mistake slide." Opal had built the mistake slide the next morning. It was a single page. It said, things that went wrong in the first trial. Below that, 1 pig escaped through a weak fence corner on day 3. The low wet corner of the paddock was overrooted by 14%. A water tub was knocked over twice on day 4. The old fence line along the west side was left standing longer than planned and had to be removed after a January storm. The riser on the middle irrigation line was damaged in a January storm, cause not yet determined. She had underlined the last line twice. The co-op meeting was held in the community room at the back of the Turner County Extension office. It was a plain room with folding chairs, bad coffee, and a projector that took 7 minutes to connect to Opal's laptop. 28 men and 4 women showed up. Wendell was not among them. Gus Kessler was. Otis Fales was. An orchard grower named Elias Marsh from a place next to the Whitfield land was sitting in the second row. He was 58 years old, thin, and had the tired look of a man who had been carrying his own note for too many months. Opal set up her laptop. She stood at the front of the room in jeans and her work boots and a green rain jacket that still had mud on the cuff. She did not oversell. That was important. She said pigs were not a miracle. They needed water shelter fencing, predator protection, daily management, and timing. They could create mess if used badly. They could damage soil if left too long. They were animals, not machines, and animals made their own opinions known. Then she showed the numbers, the 5-acre trial, residue reduction, pest scouting comparisons, cost comparisons, pig weight gain, labor hours, mistakes. The room got quiet on the mistake slide. Farmers trust a person more when they admit what went wrong. Then Opal said something the room did not expect. She said, "I would like to expand next fall, 12 acres, in cooperation with any grower in this room who wants to try a small paddock on his own place with my help under the same protocol." The room stayed quiet. Elias Marsh looked at her. He did not raise his hand, but he looked at her for a long time. Gus Kessler stood up. He said, "That is a nice presentation, Opal, but before this room gets carried away, I would like to raise a concern." She said, "Please." Gus said, "My concern is that our county cannot afford to have young growers, however well-intentioned, running experiments that damage infrastructure. I am told that a section of the Whitfield irrigation was damaged this winter, and I am told that the damage may have been related to the presence of livestock in that block." He said it kindly. He said it the way a man says a thing when he is trying to be helpful and cannot help being condescending at the same time. The room turned to look at Opal. She waited. She did not raise her voice. She said, "Mr. Kessler." He said, "Yes." She said, "The pigs were removed from the south block on November 9th. The riser damage was discovered on the night of January 11th. That is 63 days between the pigs leaving and the riser splitting." She said, "A pig has never split a PVC riser in the state of Georgia. Not on my farm, not on Charlie Beecham's farm, not on any farm I have ever read about in the extension literature." She said the riser was split along a vertical seam by a heavy object from above in the middle of a storm along a line of boot prints that entered our property from the county road and left the same way. She said, "I have photos of the prints, I have measurements, I have the receipt for the new riser, and I have the boot prints matched by tread to a brand of work boot sold in exactly one store in Turner County." She let that sit. She did not name the store. She did not need to. Half the men in the room bought their boots there. Gus Kessler's face did not move, but his hand did. He set down his coffee cup on the folding chair beside him. He did not pick it up again. The room did not speak. Finally, Elias Marsh cleared his throat. He said, "I would like to try 3 acres on my south block this fall, under your protocol." Otis Fales from the back of the room said, "I would like to attend if she will let me." Opal said, "Both of you are welcome." Gus Kessler said, "Mr. Chairman, I move we table this discussion." The chairman was an older man named Cy Bennett. Cy said, "Motion is out of order. She is a presenter, not an agenda item." Gus sat down. Opal finished her presentation. She drove home in the dark. She did not tell her father where she had been. But when she came in at 8:40 that night, he looked up from his chair in the front room, and he said only, "How many acres?" She said, "3 at Elias Marsh's place, plus our 12. He said, "Otis." She said, "He asked to attend." Wendell nodded. He said, "Cy Bennett is a good man." She said, "He shut Gus down." Wendell smiled a small, tired smile. He said, "Cy Bennett has been waiting 15 years to shut Gus down. You just gave him the reason." He looked back at his book. That was all he said. But Opal saw as she took off her jacket in the mudroom that he had turned a page. He was reading a book about pig behavior. He had not told her. He had bought it at a bookstore in Tifton 2 weeks ago. Hetty had left it on the front room table for him to find. He had found it. He had not commented on it. He was on page 93. Outside, the wind had gone still. The pecan buds were breaking a little further hour by hour into the darkness. Somewhere along a county road east of Ashburn, a white F350 was driving slowly home to a house where a man had for the first time in his life been contradicted in public by a young woman with a mud-caked green jacket and a folder full of photographs. He would not admit it that night. He would not admit it for another month. But by the time the first day of May came around, Gus Kessler would already have begun to plan the second, more careful, more deniable attempt to take the east block of the Whitfield land. And Opal would already have begun, without knowing it, to catch him. The bank letter came on a Monday afternoon in the last week of April. Hetty carried it in from the mailbox with the rest of the day's mail. 2 catalogs, a bill from the propane company, a flyer for a tractor auction in Fitzgerald, and a plain white envelope from First Peach Bank of Ashburn. She did not open it. She set it on the kitchen table. She waited for Wendell to come in for supper. When he came in at 6:10, he saw the envelope before he took off his cap. He stopped. He did not touch the envelope. He said First Peach. Hetty said First Peach. He said, "Well." He sat down. He opened it. He read it in silence. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table between himself and his wife, and he said in a voice as flat as a plumb line, 15th of June. Hetty said, "That is the date on the note." He said, "That is the date they are calling it." Hetty said, "Refinance." He said, "Denied." She said, "On what grounds?" He said, "Insufficient projected revenue for the coming season." She said, "Who signed it?" He looked at the bottom of the page. He said, "Bobby Kessler." Hetty did not answer. She did not need to. She was already reaching for the coffee pot. Opal came in from the yard 10 minutes later. She had been walking the middle block counting insect damage on marked sample rows because she did not know what else to do with a Monday afternoon. She saw the letter. She read it. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried at a kitchen table. She said 49 days. Wendell said 49 days. She said, what happens on the 50th? Wendell said foreclosure, auction, 60 days after that. Opal said the East Block. Wendell said the East Block is the collateral, but if it does not clear the note at auction, they can come after the rest. Opal said, how likely is that? Wendell said, at market, the East Block will clear it. At foreclosure prices, it might not. That is what Gus is betting on. Opal said nothing for a long time. Then she said, Farm Bureau. Wendell said, Farm Bureau has a hardship loan program. Opal said, I know, I have looked at it. Wendell said, the county board has to approve applications above 100,000. That is a 7-member board. Opal said, who is on the board? Wendell said, Cy Bennett is the chair. That is 1 vote for us. There are 2 other votes I can probably get. There are 3 votes that are firm no's because they are Gus's people. And there is 1 vote that will decide it. Opal said, whose? Wendell said, Elias Marsh. She looked up. Wendell said, yes. She said, the same Elias Marsh who signed up for 3 acres of pigs 3 weeks ago. Wendell said, the same one. She said, does he know? Wendell said, he knows we have a note. He does not know it is due on the 15th of June. He does not know Gus is running Bobby at the bank. And he does not know that his vote is going to decide whether we lose 40 acres or not. He said, and I'm not going to tell him, because if I tell him we look like beggars, and Elias Marsh has never in his life voted for a beggar. Opal said, then we do not tell him. Wendell said, no. She said, we show him the numbers. Wendell looked at her. He said, you are learning. She said, you are teaching. He said, I did not think I was. She said, you were. He did not answer that. But he picked up his coffee and he drank it and he looked at his wife. Hetty said, the meeting is May 6th. Wendell said, 9 days. Hetty said, that is enough. Wendell said, that is enough if the numbers hold. Opal said, the numbers will hold. Wendell said, good. That was the whole of the conversation. They finished supper, they cleared the table, they went to bed. And somewhere on the west side of Ashburn, Gus Kessler ate a plate of pork chops with his wife at a kitchen table in a house he had built in 2009. And he did not say a word to her about First Beach Bank or the letter or the 7-member board or the vote on the 6th of May, because Gus Kessler had spent a long time learning that the best moves are the ones you make without anyone in your own kitchen knowing they are being made. He did not know that Monday night that Opal Whitfield was at exactly the same hour sitting at her own kitchen table with a spiral notebook open in front of her writing, Bobby Kessler at First Peach, denial letter, 15th of June, 49 days, Farm Bureau vote May 6th, Elias Marsh is the swing. He did not know either that on the following morning she was going to drive out to Otis Fales's house at 6 a.m. and knock on his back door and ask him a question that would, in a way, Gus could not yet imagine, unravel the entire piece of country he had been trying to buy. But that is getting ahead. That happened on Tuesday. Opal drove to Otis Fales's house at 5:40 in the morning. She parked in the gravel drive. She walked to the back door. She knocked once. Otis opened it in his shirt sleeves. He had a coffee pot in his other hand. He did not seem surprised to see her. He said, Miss Whitfield. She said, Mr. Fales. He said, come in. She came in. His kitchen was small and clean. There was a red vinyl chair pulled up to a formica table. There was a photograph on the wall of a woman with gray hair taken in the 80s who Opal understood without asking to be his late wife. He poured her a cup. She sat. She said, Mr. Fales, 2 things. He said, go. She said, first, Gus Kessler is going to try to buy our East Block through foreclosure. His nephew at First Peach denied our refinance yesterday. The bank note is due on June 15th. Farm Bureau has a hardship loan program, but the county board vote is on May 6th. Elias Marsh is the swing vote. Elias signed up to try 3 acres of pigs on his own land this fall. My father is not going to ask him for his vote. That is not how my father works. But Elias is going to vote on May 6th, and I need to know whether he is going to vote based on what he thinks the orchard is worth or based on what Gus tells him it is worth. Otis said, that is not two things. That is one very long thing. She said, the second is a question. He said, ask. She said, you said in our kitchen in January that you had been carrying a laugh for 41 years. You said Gus's father, Cal Kessler, charged my grandpa double the going rate for pesticide in 1985 and signed the receipt with a smile. You said you were in the store and you saw it. She said, who else was in the store that morning? Otis went very still. He set down his coffee cup. He said, why? She said, because Elias Marsh's father, Roy Marsh, ran the Turner County Farm Bureau from 1979 to 1994. And if Roy Marsh knew that Cal Kessler had done that to my grandpa in 1985, and if Elias grew up in a house where Roy talked about it, then Elias already knows what Gus is. She said, I do not need Elias to vote for us because of what he owes us. I need him to vote for us because of what he already knows about Gus, but I need to know if he knows. Otis stared at her. He said, Opal. She said, yes. He said, your grandpa said one time that you were the smartest of the three of you. Your daddy is smart in the way a man is smart when he has been shown a thing twice. You are smart in the way a woman is smart when she has never needed to be shown at all. She said, was Roy Marsh in the store? Otis said, Roy Marsh was in the store. She said, did he see the receipt? Otis said, Roy Marsh signed the receipt. She stared at him. He said, not as a party, as a witness. Cal Kessler asked him to keep it clean. Roy did not want to, but Roy signed. And Roy told me 6 years later in the same kitchen you and I are sitting in right now that signing that receipt was the single thing in his life he was most ashamed of. He said, Roy died in 2003. Elias inherited his father's papers. If Roy kept a copy of that receipt, Elias has it in a box in his own house. And Elias has known without ever having to think about it exactly what kind of man Gus Kessler is for at least 22 years. Opal said, then he does know. Otis said he knows. She said he just has not had a reason to say it out loud. Otis said, that is right. She said, May 6th is a reason. Otis said, May 6th is more than a reason. May 6th is a chance. She said, for Elias. Otis said, for Elias to finish something his daddy started. She sat with that for a long time. Then she said, thank you, Mr. Fales. He said, do not thank me. Just tell your father. She said, I will not tell my father. Otis said, why not? She said, because my father does not need one more thing to carry, and Elias Marsh does not need my father asking him. Elias needs to sit at the May 6th meeting and look at Gus Kessler and remember his daddy signing a receipt in 1985 and decide by himself what kind of man he wants to be for the second half of his own life. Otis nodded once. He said, that is very close to what your grandpa would have said. She said, well. He said, well. She stood up. She said, one more thing. Otis said, yes. She said, you told me in January that Gus is his father's son, that whatever he is doing to us, he learned to do a long time ago. She said, I do not want to destroy him. Otis looked at her carefully. He said, I know. She said, I do not want him to lose his store. I do not want his wife to walk into church next Sunday and see people whispering. I do not want his nephew Bobby to lose his job at the bank. Otis said, why not? She said, because my grandpa did not build the notebook to punish anybody. He built it to change what a pecan orchard could be. And if the only thing I do with his notebook is win a fight against Gus Kessler, then I have not done what he asked me to do. Otis said, what did he ask you to do? She said, he asked me not to stop. Otis put his hand flat on the table. He said, Miss Whitfield. She said, yes. He said, you are going to be all right. She said, I hope so. He said, I know so. She drove home in the early morning light with the sun coming up over the tops of the pecan trees along State Route 32, and she did not stop at the store, and she did not stop at the co-op, and she did not stop anywhere except at the mailbox at the end of her own driveway where she pulled out a single flyer she had not noticed the day before. It was for the upcoming Farm Bureau County Board meeting, May 6th, Community Room, Extension Office, 6 p.m. She folded it in half. She put it on the dashboard. She drove up the drive. The next 8 days went by the way 8 days go by on a farm when a decision is coming. Opal walked the south block every morning. She walked the middle block every afternoon. She counted, she measured, she rewrote her numbers 3 times in her spiral notebook cleaner each time until the pages looked like something you could hand a stranger. She did not go into Ashburn. She did not go to Kessler Ag Supply. She did not go to the co-op. She did not talk to Elias Marsh. She did not call anyone. She did not need to. Otis Fales, at his own kitchen table, drank his coffee at 5:30 each morning, and at 6 each morning he made a single phone call. Not to Elias Marsh, not to Cy Bennett, not to any of the men on the 7-member board. He called Marla Marsh Elias's wife. They had known each other since 1979. They had between them been to 42 funerals in Turner County. And when a man's wife knows a thing in the country, the man usually knows it by the end of the week. Wendell did not know Opal had gone to see Otis Fales. Wendell did not know Otis Fales was calling Marla Marsh. Wendell only knew that his daughter had gone quieter in the last week and that his wife had begun humming while she washed dishes, which was a thing Hetty did only when she had already decided something. He did not ask. He was in his own way learning something too. He was learning that a man does not always have to steer. Sometimes if the women in his kitchen are steering, right, a man can just rest his hands on the wheel and let it go where it is already going. He was 63 when he learned this. He should have learned it at 33. But Wendell Whitfield had never claimed to be quick. He had only ever claimed to be steady. And on the evening of May the 6th at 5:52 p.m., he steadied himself into the driver's seat of his old pickup, and his daughter got in beside him, and Hetty got in on the other side, and they drove into Ashburn in silence, and they parked in the gravel lot behind the extension office, and they walked into the community room with the notebook. Opal was not on the agenda. She had not asked to be. The room was full. Cy Bennett sat at the head table with a gavel and a name tent. The other 6 board members sat along the sides. Gus Kessler was in the front row of the audience in a starched shirt without his cap. Elias Marsh was on the board. He was in the 3rd chair from the left. He did not look at Opal when she came in. He did not look at Gus Kessler either. He was reading a folder in front of him. Cy Bennett called the meeting to order at 6 on the dot. The first 2 items on the agenda were routine. The 3rd item was the Whitfield hardship loan application. Wendell had not put the application on the agenda. Hetty had. She had submitted it on the 10th of April, 3 weeks before the first peach denial letter, because she had learned in 1988 that a farm woman with any sense fills out the paperwork before she needs it. Cy read the application. He read the numbers. He read the notebook citations from Opal's 12-acre expansion plan. He read the letters of support from Elias Marsh regarding the 3-acre trial he had signed up for from Ida Bennett at the Extension Office and from Dr. Ruth Halsey at UGA. He asked if the applicant wished to speak. Hetty stood up. She said, "Mr. Chairman." Cy said, "Mrs. Whitfield." She said, "The applicant would like to yield her time to her daughter." Cy said, "Miss Whitfield." Opal stood up. She walked to the front. She did not have a laptop this time. She did not have a projector. She had the notebook. She set it on the podium. She said, "Members of the board, I want to say 3 things." She said, "First, my family owes First Peach Bank $210,000. That note is due on June 15th. First Peach has denied our refinance. If we do not secure a Farm Bureau hardship loan tonight, we will lose 40 acres of pecan land my grandfather planted with his own hands in 1978. That is a fact." She said, "Second, my grandfather started a project in 1984 that would have changed how this county manages pest carryover in mature pecan blocks. He stopped because his wife got sick. He never finished. He kept a notebook. I found it in September. I have spent the last 8 months finishing what he started. The 5-acre trial in the South Block this past winter reduced measurable pest carryover by more than half against a control. I have the numbers here. I will pass them around." She passed them around. She said, "Third." She paused. The room was silent. She said, "The reason I am standing in this room tonight and not writing this application from a kitchen table in a house we still owned is that a man in this county has spent the last 6 months trying to buy our land at foreclosure prices. He knows the value of our note because his nephew signs my father's refinance letters. He has offered my father a market price for the East Block that would clear our debt, but would also require my family to surrender 40 acres my grandfather planted in 1978. He is entitled to make that offer. I am not here to complain about that offer. I am here to say that I would like this county to know how much longer my grandfather would have been able to work in this orchard if that same man's father had not overcharged him for a pesticide he could not get anywhere else in the spring of 1985. She did not name Gus. She did not name Cal. She did not have to. The room understood. Elias Marsh had stopped reading his folder. He was looking at her now. He had a folder of his own in front of him. An older folder. He had brought it from home. Opal said, That is all I have to say. I would like the record to reflect that I am not asking this board to make a decision based on old debts. I am asking this board to make a decision based on the number in the middle of the third page of that application. It is a farm that has been in my family since 1978. It is worth saving. And it has in the last 12 months become worth something my grandfather would not have thought possible in 1984. That is all. She sat down. Cy Bennett looked at the board. He said, discussion. There was no discussion. Two of the 6 board members who Wendell had privately identified in the kitchen conversation as firm no's cleared their throats. Neither of them spoke. Cy said, motion. Elias Marsh raised his hand. Cy said, Mr. Marsh. Elias said, I move that the Farm Bureau County Board approve the Whitfield hardship loan application in the amount of $220,000 at the standard hardship rate for a term of 18 months, subject to standard collateral and standard reporting. Cy said second. A woman named Frances Whitcomb at the far end of the table, who Wendell had identified as one of his 2 probable votes, said second. Cy said discussion on the motion. There was no discussion. Cy said, all in favor. 4 hands went up. Cy said, opposed. 3 hands went up, slower but firm. Cy said, motion carries 4-3. He banged the gavel. Opal did not react. Wendell did not react. Hetty did not react. Gus Kessler stood up in the front row. He walked without looking at anyone out of the community room and into the parking lot. His white F350 started up. It drove away. The meeting continued. After the meeting in the parking lot, Elias Marsh came over to Wendell. He shook Wendell's hand. He said, Wendell. Wendell said, Elias. Elias said, that was overdue. Wendell said, by how many years? Elias said, 22. Wendell said, your father. Elias said, my father. They looked at each other. Elias said, I did not vote for you tonight. Wendell said, you did. Elias said, I voted for what my father should have said out loud in 1985 and did not. Wendell said, that is the same vote. Elias said, maybe. They stood there for a moment. Then Elias said, I still want the 3 acres. Wendell said, you still have them. Elias said, good. He walked to his truck. He drove home. Opal stood beside her father in the parking lot with the notebook in her hand. She said, Dad. Wendell said, yes. She said, you are shaking. He looked at his hands. He said, that is a thing that happens. She said, when? He said, when a man realizes he has been afraid of a foreclosure for 6 months and it stopped being a foreclosure 10 minutes ago. She said, yes. He said, get in the truck. They got in the truck. They drove home. Hetty did not speak the whole way, but when they pulled into the driveway, she reached over from the passenger side and she put her hand on the back of Wendell's neck for a moment. He did not react, but he did not pull away. That was Wendell Whitfield's way. The rest of that spring passed the way the rest of that spring had to pass. Opal expanded the trial to 12 acres in the fall. Elias Marsh ran 3 acres on his own land. 2 other growers, quietly without being asked, drove up to the Whitfield place on separate weekends in October to walk the paddock layouts and take notes. Charlie Beecham brought 40 pigs up from the next county on a stock trailer with a red tailgate that had been repaired 4 times by then. The trial went better in year 2 than in year 1. Opal changed the paddock size. She moved the pigs faster. She added a portable water system. She learned that pigs did best when they had enough to eat from the orchard floor, but not so little that they got bored and destructive. She learned that timing mattered more than almost anything else. Wendell learned too. He still complained. He complained about the fence. He complained about the smell. He complained about having to explain to neighbors why there were pigs under his pecan trees again. But he also helped move water lines. And when a pig got out one afternoon in the middle of November, Wendell was the first one in the truck chasing it down the lane. He caught it at the end of the drive with a length of baling twine and a piece of cornbread from his pocket that he had been saving for his coffee. The pig ate the cornbread. Wendell walked it back. He did not tell anyone about the twine. By the 3rd year, the trial covered 30 acres. That was the year the county had a hard pest season. Not a catastrophic one, not the kind people talk about for decades. Just one of those years where every small problem seemed to arrive at the same time. Warm winter, wet spring, heavy carryover, higher input costs, tighter margins. Growers were spending more and sleeping less. The Whitfield orchard still had problems. But the blocks where pigs had cleaned up post-harvest waste for 2 years were easier to manage. Not effortless. Easier. That word matters. Farming does not hand out miracles, it hands out advantages. A little less pest pressure, A little less residue, a little less spray, a little more value from an animal that also gained weight while doing the work. By the end of that season, Opal had 3 years of data. Not perfect data. Farm data never is, but enough. She had before and after counts on fallen nuts. She had soil disturbance notes. She had pest scouting comparisons. She had cleanup cost numbers. She had records of where pigs worked well and where they should never be used again. She had also, one August afternoon in the middle of that 3rd year, opened the leather notebook one more time and turned to the last written page. She had read the sentence, "The reason is not the pigs, the reason is at home." She had turned the page. She had turned another. She had already found in the 11th week of the first trial the line about the land-keeping ledgers longer than we do. But that afternoon, in the light of a hot Georgia August, she noticed something on that same page she had not noticed before. Along the very bottom edge, in pencil, not ink, faded almost to the color of the paper, a single line. She had missed it 100 times. She almost missed it again. She had to hold the notebook up to the window to read it. It said, "For whichever grandchild reads this, I did not fail because the idea was wrong. I failed because I stopped. If you have not stopped, you have not failed." Underneath, SW August 1984. Opal closed the notebook. She sat on the front porch for a long time. She did not cry at the kitchen table. She never had. But she cried on that porch on that August afternoon in the middle of the 3rd year, with the notebook closed on her knees and the sound of 30 pigs working through the orchard floor 150 yards away. She cried the way a person cries when a thing has finally worked. Not the way a person cries when a thing has failed. There is a difference. Wendell came out at some point. He did not say anything. He sat down beside her on the porch. He did not put his arm around her. They were not that kind of family. He just sat there. After a while, he said, "Your grandfather was a stubborn man." She said, "I know." He said he was not stubborn enough. She said, "I know." He said, "You were." She wiped her face on her sleeve. She said, "I had help." He said, "That is the definition of stubborn enough." He looked out at the pigs. He said, "Show me later." She said, "Show you what?" He said, "Whatever you were reading in that notebook." She said, "I will." He said, "But not today." She said, "Not today." He said, "Today we have supper. Your mother made a pot roast." She smiled. He stood up. He offered her his hand. She took it. He pulled her to her feet. They walked into the house. By the time they reached the kitchen, Hetty had set 3 places at the table. She looked at her husband. She looked at her daughter. She looked at their boots, which had left a trail of red clay all the way from the back door. She did not say anything about the clay. She only said, "Sit down, both of you, eat." They sat. They ate. Halfway through the pot roast, Wendell set down his fork. He said, "Opal." She looked up. He said, "There is something I want to do tomorrow morning." She said, "What?" He said, "I want to run the pigs myself. Sunrise, just me. You sleep in, your mother sleeps in. I will handle the whole rotation." Opal said, "Dad." He said, "I have been watching for 3 years. I know the paddock plan. I know the count. I know which pig is the boss and which pig is the follower and which pig always finds the weakest fence corner in every rotation and stands there looking at me like she has a job to do." Opal smiled. She said, "That one is deputy." He said, "I know she is." She said, "You are not supposed to know that." He said, "I know a lot of things I am not supposed to know." He picked up his fork again. He said, "I want to run them one morning, that is all." Opal said, "Why?" He looked at his plate. He said, "Because I have not yet." That was the whole of his answer. The next morning was a Sunday. The rain had stopped 2 days earlier. The sky was the color of thinned milk. The orchard was steaming. The red clay in the alleys was still soft, but the pecan floor under the trees had begun to dry in patches where the wind had touched it, and somewhere on the north fence line a mockingbird was arguing with a blue jay about a piece of ground that neither of them owned. Wendell came out of the house at 6:08. He was wearing his coveralls. He was carrying a bucket of feed and a length of baling twine. He walked across the yard to the paddock. The lead pig was already at the gate. She was a large red hog with a slightly darker patch on her shoulder and a way of walking that suggested she considered herself the eldest of a large family. She looked at him. She did not move. For a long moment, the two of them stood there, the 63-year-old man and the red hog, and neither of them said anything because neither of them needed to. Wendell shook the bucket once. The pig came through the gate. The other 29 pigs came out behind her. They followed Wendell down the tractor lane between the older pecan trees into the east block, where the pressure had been worst, where every spring for the last 8 years had cost the family something they could not spare. Halfway down the row, Wendell stopped. He bent down. There was a broken pecan half buried in the mulch at his feet. The shell split the meat inside, gone black with mold. He picked it up between his thumb and forefinger. He looked at it. Then he turned and he tossed it underhand toward the flock. A pig caught it before it hit the ground. Wendell stood in the middle of the row with his hand still open in the shape of the throw. He said very quietly to no one in particular, "Well, Daddy would have laughed at me for taking this long." Then he closed his hand. He picked up the bucket. He kept walking. Opal was watching from the kitchen window. She had not slept in. Neither had Hetty. They stood at the sink together side by side without speaking, holding cups of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and they watched Wendell Whitfield walk his father's orchard behind a flock of pigs his father had almost bought in 1984. Hetty did not comment. Opal did not comment. But Opal reached without looking, and she took her mother's hand. Hetty let her. That was the last small moment of that third year. The rest is the shape of the years that followed. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday in September, a white F350 pulled slowly into the Whitfield driveway. Opal was cleaning filters near the pump shed when it stopped. Gus Kessler got out of the truck. He walked slowly across the gravel. He did not go to the house. He came to her. He said, "Opal." She said, "Mr. Kessler." He said, "Gus is fine." She said, "Mr. Kessler is fine." He nodded. He looked toward the east block. He said, "I heard your third-year numbers held." She said, "They did." He said, "How much lighter?" She said, "Depends what number you care about." He smiled a little. And she walked him through the block. She showed him where the pigs had been. She showed him the low corner where they had done too much rooting in year one. She showed him the marked trees. She showed him the control area. She showed him the photos. She showed him the trap counts. Gus listened. That was different from the coffee counter. He was not holding court now. He was asking questions. How long were they in each paddock? How wet was the ground? What size pigs? How did you keep them off the irrigation? Did you see any root damage later? Opal answered all of it. And then Gus asked the question she had been waiting for. He said, "If a 250-acre orchard wanted to try this without making a disaster, where would you start?" Opal looked at him. She said, "You don't start with 250 acres. He said, "No." She said, "You start with 5, maybe 10. After harvest, mature trees only, no wet ground, no young blocks, good fence, good water, daily checks before and after counts, and a control block." He said, "A control block?" She said, "Yes." He looked at the orchard floor. He said, "You really do like measuring things." She shrugged. She said, "It keeps people honest." He nodded. This time he did not smile. He said, "Opal." She said, "Yes." He said, "I would like to apologize." She said, "For which part?" He said, "For all of it." She looked at him. She said, "Mr. Kessler." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am not going to make you list them, not out loud, not standing in my daddy's orchard. That is not the kind of apology this county needs. But I want you to know that I know all of them, and I want you to know that we are not going to say them out loud either. Because your wife walks into my church on Sunday, and your nephew still works at First Peach, and you have 31 years left in this county, and you get to spend them being a different man than the one you were last April." She said, "That is the deal." Gus Kessler stood in the middle of a Whitfield orchard he had once tried to buy for less than it was worth, and he did not answer for a long time. Finally he said, "That is a better deal than I deserve." She said, "I know." He said, "Why are you giving it to me?" She said, "Because my grandfather did not build a notebook to punish anybody. He built it to change what a pecan orchard could be. And if the only thing I do with his notebook is destroy you, then I have not done what he asked me to do." Gus Kessler nodded slowly once. He said, "What did he ask you to do?" She said, "He asked me not to stop." Gus said, "All right." He walked back to his truck. He drove away. Opal went back to cleaning the filters. She did not tell her father. She did not need to. Wendell had been standing in the shop doorway for the whole conversation, out of sight, with a wrench in his hand and a look on his face like a man who has just watched his daughter do something he was not sure he would have been able to do himself. When she came into the shop half an hour later, he did not look up from the workbench. He said only, "Coffee is on." She said, "I know." He said, "There is a piece of pie left." She said, "Save it." He said, "For who?" She said, "For you." He said, "Fair." That was the whole of that conversation. By the end of that third year, Opal had been invited to speak at a regional growers meeting in Tifton, Georgia. She was 30 years old that year. She wore jeans boots and a dark green jacket because hotel conference rooms are always too cold. There were about 100 people in the room: pecan growers, extension agents, crop consultants, a few livestock people, and at least 3 men who had once made pig jokes at Wendell's expense. Gus Kessler was sitting near the back. Wendell was sitting 2 rows behind him. Opal stood at the front with a slide that said "Pigs in Mature Pecan Orchards: What Worked, What Failed, and What We Measured." She did not oversell it. That was why people listened. She told them pigs were not a replacement for pest management. She told them pigs could damage soil if left too long. She told them wet ground was a bad idea. She told them young trees needed protection. She told them bad fencing would turn a trial into a countywide comedy show. People laughed at that because it was true. Then she showed the numbers: 5-acre trial, 12-acre trial, 30-acre trial, residue reduction, pest scouting differences, cost comparisons, pig weight gain, labor requirements, mistakes. The room got quiet when she showed the mistake slide. Farmers trust a person more when they admit what went wrong. Opal showed the low, wet corner from year 1. She showed the place where pigs had rooted deeper than planned. She showed the broken water tub. She showed the section they had decided never to graze again. She showed the riser that had been split in January of the first year, and she said in a level voice, "This one was not a pig." Nobody in the room asked what she meant. Half of them already knew. Then she showed the blocks where it worked: the older trees, the drier ground, the short duration paddocks, the before and after photos of orchard floors with rotten nuts, then without them. When the questions started, they were not the questions people ask when they think something is ridiculous. They were practical questions. How many pigs per acre? How many days? What size animal? What about predators? What about food safety? How soon after harvest? What if the ground is wet? What if I do not own pigs? Opal answered what she knew, and when she did not know, she said so. That helped too. Near the end, one older grower stood up and said, "My concern is people hear this and think they can just throw hogs under trees and call it regenerative." Opal nodded. She said, "That is my concern too." She said, "The pigs are not the system. The management is the system. The fence, the timing, the soil conditions, the tree age, the records. Without that, they are just pigs in an orchard. And pigs in the wrong place can do a lot of damage." Gus Kessler leaned back in his chair. Wendell looked down at his hands. He was smiling. After the meeting, Gus came up while Opal was packing her laptop. He said, "You did good." She said, "Thanks." He said, "I should have listened earlier." She said, "You listened before most people." Gus shook his head. "I laughed first. Most people did." He looked toward the empty screen. He said, "You still selling that control block idea?" She said, "Every chance I get." He said, "Good, keep selling it." Then he walked out. Wendell waited until the room had mostly cleared. He came to the front and picked up the box of leftover handouts. Opal looked at him. She said, "You don't have to carry that." He said, "I know." Then he carried it anyway. The next spring, Opal's cousin Cyrus came to the farm with an idea. He was 21 years old, studying natural resources at Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College, and he had the same nervous look Opal probably had when she first put the pig maps in front of her father. He found her in the shop where she was repairing a fence charger. He said, "I've been reading about ducks around irrigation ponds." Opal looked up. He said, "Not just ducks. Controlled access around pond edges for snails, insects, some weed pressure, maybe after the main nesting season for wild birds. I do not know yet. I just think there might be something there." He handed her a printed article and a messy, hand-drawn map. Opal looked at the map. She thought about her father at the kitchen table. She thought about Gus Kessler laughing at the coffee counter. She thought about the pigs walking into the south block that first morning while everyone watched like disaster had just learned to snort. Then she looked at Cyrus. She said, "Have you counted what is in the pond edges now?" He said, "Not yet, She said, "Then start there. Baseline first. Snails, insects, weeds, water quality, all of it. And find me the full study, not just the article." Cyrus grinned like somebody had opened a gate. He said, "I will get it." He ran off toward his truck. 6 months later, Cyrus came back. He had a folder under his arm this time. He had a spiral notebook in his back pocket. He had on his boots the same red Georgia clay his cousin had walked into that shop with 3 years earlier. Opal was in the kitchen when she saw him coming across the yard. She poured him a cup of coffee before he reached the back door. He sat down at the table. He opened the folder. He said, "Baseline. Snails per meter of pond edge, average of 11. Insects, 42 species identified so far. Weed pressure, 7 types, 3 of them invasive. Water quality, mostly good, but there is a nitrogen spike downstream of the North Pond that I cannot explain yet." He said, "I brought the full study, both of them. I read them twice." Opal looked at the numbers. She looked at her cousin. She said, "You did what I asked." He said, "I did." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you told me to." She said, "That is not enough of a reason to stay with a hard idea." He said, "No, it is not. The reason is that on my way home in April, I stopped at the co-op and I heard Gus Kessler say something to a young grower I did not know. He said, if you're going to try something new on your place, do not do it the way that Whitfield Girl did. Do it slower, do it with a control block, do it with numbers, because if you cannot show it in numbers, nobody's going to listen to you, no matter how right you are." Cyrus said he was quoting you. He did not know I was in the aisle. Opal did not answer for a moment. Then she said, "That is not a reason either. That is just proof." Cyrus said, "Then the reason is this." He reached into his back pocket. He pulled out an envelope. The envelope was old. The paper was yellow. It had been folded and refolded. He said, "My mama gave this to me the day I told her I was coming to see you again. She said her daddy gave it to her before he died. Her daddy is Silas Whitfield. She said Silas wrote it in 1984 and never mailed it." Opal took the envelope. Her hands did not shake, but her mother, standing at the sink, went very still. The envelope was addressed in Silas's handwriting to a name Opal did not recognize. "To whichever child of my child is willing to look down." She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was dated August 1984. It said, "I am folding the paper today because your grandmother needs me. I am not folding it because the idea is wrong. I am folding it because a man is only given so many hours in a summer, and this one has already been claimed. If you are reading this, then someone in this family has kept looking down. That is enough. The land keeps ledgers longer than we do. I will not see the second harvest, but you will. Silas Whitfield." Opal read it twice. She put it back in the envelope. She looked at her mother. Hetty was crying. Hetty did not cry. Opal had never in 27 years seen her mother cry at that sink. But Hetty was crying now quietly, the way a woman cries when a debt she did not know she was carrying has finally been paid. Opal stood up. She walked to the wall by the pantry. She lifted the frame that held the last written page of the leather notebook off the nail where it had hung for 13 months. She took the frame down. She opened the back of it. She slid the letter in behind the last written page. She closed the frame. She hung it back on the wall. She said, "Now it is together." Cyrus said, "Now it is together." Wendell had come in from the yard while she was hanging the frame. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his cap in his hand. He looked at the frame on the wall. He looked at his wife at the sink. He looked at his daughter and his nephew at the table. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he walked to the wall. He looked at the letter through the glass. He read it. He read it again. Finally, he said, "He wrote that in the same August he folded the paper bag." Hetty said, "Yes." He said, "He knew." Hetty said, "He hoped." Wendell nodded once. Then he turned back to the table. He said, "Cyrus." Cyrus said, "Yes, sir." Wendell said, "You come out to the shop tomorrow morning at 5:30. I want to walk the North Pond with you before the light comes up. Bring the map." Cyrus said, "Yes, sir." Wendell said, "And Cyrus." Cyrus said, "Yes, sir." Wendell said, "Do not stop." That was all he said. He put his cap back on. He walked out. The next morning at 5:43, generations of Whitfields were standing at the edge of the North Irrigation Pond in Turner County, Georgia. Opal was pointing at a stretch of shoreline where the reeds had grown too thick. Wendell was measuring the slope with the folding wooden ruler that had been in the cedar crate for 41 years. Cyrus was writing in his own notebook with a pencil borrowed from his cousin in a hand that was still learning to slow down enough to be careful. The pigs in the paddock behind the shop would not be moved until November. The ducks Cyrus was planting were still just a folder. The orchard was quiet. But somewhere in the space between the pond and the pecan trees and the cedar crate and the frame on the kitchen wall, four ledgers had begun finally to add up. Silas Whitfield's from 1984, Wendell Whitfield's from every year in between, Opal Whitfield's from 3 years of pigs, and Cyrus Beecham's opening at page 1 on a Wednesday morning in April at the edge of an irrigation pond that had been waiting for a long time to be looked at. The sun came up over Turner County. The wind smelled like turned earth from 100 different farms at once. And on the kitchen wall of a plain white farmhouse west of Ashburn, Georgia, in a frame Opal had made herself, the last written page of a leather notebook and a letter that had never been mailed sat side by side under glass the way two halves of a sentence sit when the sentence has finally, after 41 years, been allowed to end. That is how farms change most of the time. Not all at once, not with speeches, not because one person wins an argument. They change when somebody notices a problem everyone else has learned to step over. They change when somebody is willing to look foolish for one season. They change when the land answers back with numbers. Opal Whitfield let pigs into a pecan orchard where everyone else saw only risk. They laughed. Then spring came, the pests came with it, and the orchard that had been cleaned by snouts and hooves carried less trouble into the new year. The notebook was not flashy. The pigs were not perfect. The idea was not magic. But the ground had been telling the truth the whole time. The problem was never that the orchard needed more noise, more fuel, or another product on a shelf. The problem was that everyone kept looking up at the trees while next year's trouble was sleeping under their feet. And once Opal learned to look down, the pigs knew exactly what to do. The land keeps ledgers longer than we do. Silas Whitfield. 1932 to 2011. He planted an orchard, he raised a son, he kept a notebook, he almost once brought in pigs, and 41 years later, in the hands of a granddaughter he had never met and a great-nephew he never would, the second harvest finally came.